This morning in the New Zealand Herald, and I've asked for it to be put up on the platform, and I hope you can read it for yourself. But if you can't, just go to Google's New Zealand Herald this morning, and you'll see an article there from Owen Jennings, why farmers are still angry about emissions proposals. Owen joins me this morning. Good morning to you, Owen. How are you?
I'm well, Michael, and yourself?
I'm good, and I'm glad to see that you're still around and contributing to the policy debate of this country.
I'm supposed to be retired, Michael, but I just get so angry when I see so many people misusing the science around methane, and so we're just important to try and get some balance and some truth out there.
Now, to the point that you, according to the little byline that was in the Herald this morning, you were the manager of facts about ruminant methane, so FARM. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. FARM's a group of farmers, scientists, business people who are concerned about what is being spread about ruminant methane, and just want people to focus back on the science, focus back on the facts.
Now, there's a professor, I think, I'm trying to remember her name, from Waikato University. Is she one of your lot? Is it Howarth? Jacqueline Howarth, or Howarth, is it?
Jacqueline has got a lot of concerns along with us on this issue. She's not part of our organisation because she likes to remain independent, but we have much in common, and many of the issues that are important to us she is equally concerned about.
Okay. Now, your basic thesis is that the government has unfairly singled out the agricultural community as, well, basically the primary emitter of not just carbon emissions, but of methane in particular. Have I got that right?
Yes, you have. I mean, there are headlines about farmers contributing 48% of the greenhouse gases that New Zealand emits, which is a nonsense. It's important to go back and look at the fundamental science about ruminant methane. And the Climate Change Commission actually made a lot of statements that were absolutely correct, but came to the wrong conclusions. I mean, one of the things they said is that when ruminant methane emissions are stable or falling, as they are in New Zealand, then there's no additional warming. And that's because methane only lasts about 10 years in the atmosphere before it disappears. And so if there's no additional methane being emitted in that kind of environment, if you will, the mass of methane in the atmosphere, ruminant methane, is actually falling. Therefore, there's less up there, there's less to do any warming. And the result is that in a falling situation, as we have in New Zealand, we are contributing to cooling, not warming. Now, the Climate Change Commission, the Commissioner for the Environment and Ministry for the Environment have all said the same thing. When there's stable emissions, as there are in New Zealand, there's no additional warming.
Okay, so if that's the case, first of all, what would you attribute the drop in methane rumen emissions to be in that time?
It's just basically that farmers get more efficient year by year. They get better at their management practices. They're adopting methods to reduce methane. There are a number of technologies that are available and more coming into the farming community that allow farmers to produce less methane. So there's been a steady increase. It's not a dramatic decrease. It's not a dramatic decrease. There was a surge late last century, but that's now plateaued and is starting to reduce again. That increase was associated with the swing to dairying, but now that's stabilised. And with methane only lasting 10 years, you only have to look at the last 10 years to see what's happening. And in the current environment, in the current situation, those levels are falling. The Climate Change Commission made that very clear in graphs that they published. And that means that as I said, where in actual fact farmers are contributing to cooling, not warming.
So given that you obviously feel very strongly about the science supporting your point of view, why would the government be coming up with policy that is determined to a different conclusion?
Well, it's quite interesting. If you go into the detail of it, the IPCC, which is the international body established to, look at the whole greenhouse gas issue, doesn't really deal in great depth with methane emissions. And they tended to get sidelined, obviously with all of the focus being on CO2, on carbon dioxide. And what happened was that a situation arose where it was difficult to measure methane alongside CO2. CO2 is reputed to be a much longer lasting gas, whereas methane is short-lived, but methane is claimed to be much more potent than CO2 when you compare molecule with molecule. Now, there's significantly less methane. I mean, if you look at the numbers, all methane from all sources is only 2 parts per million, less than 2 parts, but 2 parts per million. Ruminant methane is only 14% of that, and New Zealand has 1% of the ruminant. So, we're not making any major contribution, but the problem was that methane got linked to CO2 with a strange formula, which has since been shown to be absolutely fallacious and absolutely useless when methane emissions are stable. And that is what led to the New Zealand government saying 48% of our emissions are coming from agriculture. It's just not the case. It's not sound science, and it's been shown to be unsound science.
Owen, I'm looking at a Stats New Zealand release, which you've probably seen as well. And it says gross methane emissions are mainly produced by livestock, about 88%. And then it says methane emissions from livestock in 2019 were up 9% from 1990 and down 1.6% from 2005. Livestock methane emissions in 2019 were mainly produced by cattle digestion and sheep digestion. That would suggest that Stats New Zealand are running a different series of stats than your article at the moment.
No, they're not. And if you look at using 1990 as a base, it's quite deceptive. As I said, with methane only lasting 10 years in the atmosphere, you can only view the last 10 years. I mean, I like to use analogies, and people relate to, simple analogies. It's like having 100 people in a room, and you've got 2 people coming into the room and 2 people going out of the room. The number of people in the room stays the same. If you've got 2 people entering the room and 3 leaving the room, then the number in the room starts to fall. Now, that's what's happening with methane. The methane only lasting 10 years. So going back to 1990, it is erroneous. In fact, it's deceptive. You only look at the last 10 years, and during that 10 years, as stats shows, the ruminant methane levels are falling. And that's the important thing to focus on. In a falling ruminant methane emissions situation, then there is no additional warming. In fact, there's cooling, because that mass of methane is actually diminishing. It's reducing, and that means there's less warming taking place in the atmosphere as a result of New Zealand farmers' output.
But if we look at gross greenhouse gas emissions, according to Stats New Zealand, they were made up of carbon dioxide 45%, methane 42%, nitrous oxide 10%. You're suggesting that most methane emissions are from livestock. I think that's accepted. That's generally accepted. Yes. Is that right? But you're saying that is reducing. It hasn't reduced a lot, 1.6% from 2005, but it's not going up. And you're saying that as farmers become more effective and efficient, it will reduce, I guess, also with new crops coming onto the market and things like that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it is. And the graphs in the Climate Change Commission report show that. They show the line heading down quite decidedly, very obviously. I mean, the thing to remember too, Michael, is that, ruminant methane comes from the activities in the gut of the livestock as a result of eating something called grass. Mm. And if you remember your Form 3 science, grass comes about from photosynthesis in the leaf of the grass, and photosynthesis comes about because grass absorbs large quantities of CO2, carbon dioxide. So what's really happening is a kind of a roundabout. You've got CO2 being taken up by the grass, turned into ruminant methane being put back into the atmosphere. And so you've got a situation, unlike cars and fossil fuel, where in actual fact there's a closed natural cycle going on, and that use of CO2 by farmers in their grass and in their other vegetation on their farm is ignored. I mean, it's ridiculous because we've got companies here from overseas coming and planting trees, subsidised by the state.
That's correct.
They're given money to put in trees so they can suck up or sequester, as it's called, CO2. Farmers sequester methane, CO2 every hour of every daylight hour of the day, but they get no recognition. In fact, they get cashed for it. They get the very opposite.
So what you're suggesting is...
How ridiculous is that?
But you're saying, Owen, that grass sequesters CO2.
Yes, absolutely. You learned that back in Form 3 science, didn't you?
Right. So but also, I've had that discussion this morning, saying that neither winery plantations, grape plantations or orchards, they're not counted because there's the arbitrary, is it 5 metre rule, I think? So unless a tree is over 5 metres, it's not regarded as being part of the sequestering process. Yes,
but, if you're going to subsidise
I understand
particularly offshore companies.
I understand your point.
You've got to recognise that there's an inequity there.
Oh, listen, and I think the government does too now, actually. I know that the government's now worked out that carbon forestry farming is not, in actual fact, the way to go. They've got a lot of pushbacks from rural communities, as you'll be aware, as to not just are these foreign companies doing this, but also they're taking productive land out of the operation as well.
Well, let's compare a cow with a car. The use of fossil fuels comes because we're extracting oil, which was once vegetation millions of years ago, and we're putting that into the atmosphere. A cow uses CO2 via grass and produces methane. It's a totally different situation, and you can't take what they call the marginal warming or the net effect without recognising the fact that farmers are using CO2 every hour of the daylight time.
Okay, now the other thing is you just he waka eka noa.
Yes.
I've been trying to look for an English translation of that. We keep on coming up with a free ride. Have I got that wrong?
No, you haven't.
I haven't got it wrong.
No. It's kind of the free ride thing is that the government are getting a free ride on the back of the farmers. The rest of the community is getting a free ride on the back of the farmers.
Well, it seems a very odd thing to call, doesn't it? Really?
Oh, I think there's a little bit of cynicism in that, isn't it? But it's really we're all in the waka together, which is a nice thought. And what's upsetting farmers is that our farming leaders, through organisations like Dairy NZ and Beef and Lamb and Federated Farmers, have sort of sucked up this idea that somehow we have to pay tax for something that's not contributing to additional warming. I mean, why they've done that is because they're feeling the pressure from this constant barrage of criticism and nonsense that's going on about how bad farmers are in the way they handle the environment. And farmers are under massive pressure. You mentioned when you did the intro, the farmers are under massive pressure on so many fronts at the moment, and their leadership is really just cowered down to that pressure and said, well, we better pay something, even if we don't actually believe the science tells us that we ought to.
You're talking about an average cost of $50,000 a year in taxes for an average dairy farm in the South Island, for example. That's what you say it's going to cost.
Well, it is, but if the carbon price goes to the levels that Minister James Shaw wants it to go to, then that 50,000 becomes more like 300,000, and that's more than the net profit of an average dairy farm in Canterbury, for example. So it's not just what might happen now; it's what will happen if the carbon price goes to the levels that people like James Shaw and many of the green groups are demanding it goes to.
One of the things, and just to digress for a second, you're seeing it in organisations like Groundswell that are coming through, I think they had a public meeting in my neck of the woods just last night, for example, well attended. The mayor from Central Otago got absolutely cauterised for suggesting that it was easier to work with the government than against them. But one of the things that comes out of this is that there is a growing dislocation, I guess is the best word to describe it, between the rural community and between the metropolitan community. And that divide seems to be growing daily, Owen, and I can't see that as useful.
No, it's very destructive. This government has been divisive on a number of fronts, I believe, and the whole Three Waters issue. There are many other issues where I think there's unnecessary division being caused, not just between town and country, but between people of race and backgrounds and whatever. Look, there is huge support in many cities and towns in New Zealand for the farming community. They recognise the contribution that's being made to the community. They recognise the hours that are being worked, the stress that many farmers are under, and that support is valued by farmers. There are those who are in opposition, of course, but no, the divisive factor is quite alarming, and there are other issues, Michael, at stake here. New Zealand signed up to the Paris Accord. The Paris Accord very clearly in Article 2B says that no government should take any action against food production when it's making its regulations for greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if we bring in what is advocated for farmers in New Zealand and cut production by 15%, that's in direct contravention of that agreement. It goes absolutely against it. But it's even worse than that, because if farmers cut back production here of foodstuffs, then that food is going to be produced somewhere else in the world where there's a higher carbon footprint. So cutting back production here, in actual fact, will increase the amount of greenhouse gas emission, not decrease it. That's how utterly absurd the current arrangements look.
No, you and I are on the same bat there, because my argument is that New Zealand taking arbitrary and independent action from the rest of the world is only going to hurt us, and that the primary emitters, China, Russia, India, United States of America, are essentially getting a free ride whilst we decide to go through the same, and you and I will disagree on this one, the same sort of Rogernomics revolution where we decide that we're going to lead the world in something and find that suddenly the rest of the world aren't following us. This seems one of those, Owen.
It is. And farmers are angry because all of they're asking for is let's go back to the science. The science is clear. There is no additional warming occurring from ruminant emissions of New Zealand farmers. They say stick with the Paris Accord that says, don't affect, reduce the amount of food that's being produced in the world. The world's hungry. We can't afford. We're a massive producer of food, and we can't afford to inflict pain on people who need our food because of some weird and unscientific nonsense that's occurring here.
Yes, I'm reading an article now too. It says to be this agreement in enhancing the implementation of the convention, including its objective, aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by, and then B is, increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change and foster climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food production.
Precisely. Very clear, very unambiguous, and you ought to hear people like Minister Shaw trying to get around that.
Well, what does Minister Shaw say to that?
Wordy nonsense about, that only applies to developing countries.
Well, it doesn't say that here.
He can't explain it away.
No.
It's impossible to explain
it doesn't.
away.
All right. Owen, thank you so much.
And it's worse, Michael, than just, playing with words. It's affecting people's lives. We can't afford to cut food production, and that upsets farmers, because part of the reason why we farm is because we know we're making a contribution, around the globe to the well-being of people.
Owen, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you here and to hear your view. We will be publishing, Owen, your piece from the New Zealand Herald on the platform, and you can read it for yourself.